everyone. Welcome. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is a social justice nonprofit that mobilizes justice-seeking people of faith to take action on issues of peace, poverty, and people's rights within the church, the nation, and the world. We're really excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our coalition partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. A few announcements about our call today. We invite you to continue to keep your video off and your audio on mute. This will help with our connection. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. Since you have registered for this webinar, we have your email, and so that information will be emailed out in the coming days. We ask that for the rest of the webinar that you use the chat only for questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box as they come to you. We are also offering closed captioning and apologize for any spelling mistakes or any other errors. The closed captioning is automatically generated. Our webinars are a place to learn, engage, and be in community together. And we also do not tolerate any sort of hate speech in our chat or in our conversations. So we encourage you to please be respectful of that. And before we start our time today, a verdict was issued yesterday on the murder of George Floyd. And very soon after Ma'Khia Bryant was killed by police yesterday in Columbus, Ohio. She was 15 years old. We pray for her family and all the families and communities. We must continue to work to dismantle white supremacy from all of our social systems, in our communities, in our church, and in ourselves. And we acknowledge that many of the same policing tactics and systems are also being used and taught around the world, also by the Israeli military against Palestinians. Our conversation today on the right to boycott is one of the many tools we have to have our voices heard. So I thank you so much for being here. And we will now turn this over to our moderator, John from UMKR.
Greetings again. I'm John Wagner. I'm co-chair along with Lisa Bender of United Methodist for Kairos Response. And again, just a pleasure to be with you here today. We have a speaker, and then we will have some panelists. The panelists will talk about their experience in organizing to oppose the so-called anti-BDS legislation that has succeeded or been proposed in many states here in the United States. And it's also been a problem in other parts of the world, Germany, United Kingdom, and some other places. Our first speaker, however, is MEERA SHAH. MEERA oversees Palestinian or Palestine Legal's advocacy work on free speech, academic freedom, and the right to boycott. She's an attorney in New York City. She's devoted her career to advancing human rights and social justice for marginalized communities. Before law school, she worked as a media coordinator for the Middle East Research and Information Project. So we're going to start with MEERA, and then we'll have our panelists later. The chat will be disabled just so we can focus on what she has to say, the important words she needs to share with us right now. MEERA.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks to you and Bridget for that introduction and this invitation. I really I'm grateful to be with you all and to be speaking with you all. I'm going to share my screen for a presentation just while I'm talking, and do that right now. And just get started here. Is that working? Can everyone see that? Okay. What I'll do is I'm just going to turn my camera off while I'm talking just to focus on the slides here. I'm going to start just by a quick introduction to Palestine Legal and our work. I'd like to provide just a little bit of background and context on the movement for Palestinian rights here in the US. and then turn to the topic, the sort of overview of the legislative assault targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights here in the US, and to talk about ways to push back. I'll finish up just by hopefully showing you all a little bit about our new legislation site, kind of navigating around some of the resources there. I am going to try to move fairly quickly because I really think that the state sort of on the ground advocates that are on the panel have just so much to offer, and I really want to make sure that there's enough time for that. Okay, so quick introduction to Palestine Legal. We are a legal advocacy organization. Our mission is to bolster the grassroots movement for Palestinian rights here in the US. We provide legal advice, know your rights trainings, advocacy and litigation support to college students, grassroots activists, and others who stand for justice in Palestine. We also document and track tactics that are being used to silence advocates for Palestinian rights, including repressive legislation. So where to start? There's a growing solidarity movement here in the US. It is often student-led, it is diverse, it's dynamic. We see a range of different actors engaging in different forms of advocacy, including boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, to stand against Israeli violations, from churches to campuses to academic boycotts and cultural boycotts. The movement is increasingly characterized by cross-movement support. It's interconnected with Indigenous, Black, and other racial justice struggles. It's also important to note that these allies are often the ones that are most targeted by censorship and harassment. We see the movement increasingly filtering up from the grassroots as well, with athletes, artists, celebrities, and even more politicians who are willing to break from the status quo. I'm just going to note to the unprecedented federal bill introduced just last week by Representative Betty McCollum, seeking accountability for human rights violations as one example of this. At the same time, the growing movement for Palestinian rights here, it's a response to the ongoing and systematic violations of Palestinian rights. And, we see this in the decades-long blockade and repeated destruction of Gaza, unending settlement growth, systematic human rights abuses, growing apartheid-like conditions in Israel, with the full backing and financial support of the US. The decades-long impunity and lack of accountability sort of coalesced, and sorry, I'll just go back a slide here, 15 years ago around a call from Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until it complies with its international legal obligations. This call is modeled after anti-apartheid efforts that put international pressure on South Africa during that apartheid regime. So just some background there on BDS, maybe familiar to many of you already. What we've seen though, is that these calls for freedom, equality, and justice for Palestinians and criticism of Israel's treatment of Palestinians have been met with efforts to censor, chill, and sanction. Palestine Legal has documented widespread censorship and harassment of Palestine activists over the years, over 1,700 incidents documented since 2014. Some tactics that we see over and over, we see sort of school administrators seeking greater scrutiny or restrictions on student events related to Palestine. Schools going so far as to ban student groups organizing for Palestinian rights, Fordham SJPs being an example of that. Faculty being investigated for coursework or syllabus material related to Palestinian rights and Israeli violations, and hundreds of other incidents. False accusations lay the foundation for many of these tactics, smearing the movement and advocates with accusations of anti-Semitism or links to terrorism. And increasingly, more of the most egregious tactics involve state repression, including legislation. So we're seeing several different trends in legislation targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights. And this is a screenshot of our legislation site that I'll show you in just a minute. We have over 200 bills that have been introduced since 2014 targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights. The majority of these have failed, but there are 30 states at least with these kinds of laws on the books. Recently this year, lawmakers in West Virginia, Utah, and Idaho have passed anti-boycott bills that are newly passed. What are these bills? I'm going to talk about two different kinds that we've been tracking. The first are anti-boycott or anti-BDS laws. They prohibit state contracts with or state investment in entities that boycott Israel or territories occupied by Israel. These laws often require potential state contractors to provide a written certification or loyalty oath, McCarthyite tactic, that they are not and will not engage in boycotts against Israel. or its settlements. Some states require officials to compile and make publicly available blacklists of entities that support boycotts, prohibiting state contracts or investments with listed entities. These laws have a material impact on the livelihoods and lives of those directly affected by them. You've seen denial of contracts, for example, a speech pathologist in Texas, Bahia Amoui, who challenged that law in Texas, who was denied a contract for refusing to sign that kind of a loyalty oath. Abby Martin, a filmmaker and journalist who refused to sign Georgia's certification law as part of a conference she was speaking at a university. You know, these are specific examples of how these laws impact individuals, but the laws have a chilling effect on speech far beyond their stated objectives and the sort of direct effect. There's confusion over the scope or deliberate misapplication of these laws, which has resulted in chilling or punishing or attempting to punish speakers supporting Palestinian rights in a range of different contexts outside that of state funding or contracts. One example of that, I think, is from a few years ago, where hurricane relief was conditioned in a town in Texas on signing a written certification that, you know, small businesses would not boycott Israel in order to receive that funding. You know, lawmakers pulled back and said that that was a misapplication, but, you know, I think this is an example of how these laws are used to chill. And, you know, that's the goal, you know, is that, you know, the laws are designed to chill you into self-censorship. I think the good news is that so far, courts have found these laws to be unconstitutional. Earlier this year, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed a lower court, finding that the Arkansas anti-boycott law violates the First Amendment. And with that decision, you know, not a single anti-boycott law has been upheld on the merits. Instead, rather, courts have found that boycotts for Palestinian rights are not distinguishable from historical civil rights boycotts that the Supreme Court has said are protected under the First Amendment. Rather than addressing the concerns raised by these decisions, though, many state legislatures have chosen instead to narrow the scope of these laws in order to carve out the plaintiffs that have been challenging them. For example, by limiting the application only to bigger companies rather than, you know, sole proprietors, or increasing the threshold amount of contracts so that, you know, it has to be a state contract over $100,000 in order for the prohibition to apply. But the underlying constitutional concerns and the broader chilling effect remain unchanged. And I'm hoping, you know, in addition to sort of court challenges, many states have also, you know, organizers have pushed back, preventing these laws from being put in place in the first place, and or challenging them in different ways once they are in effect. And I'm hoping that, you know, we'll hear more about that from the other panelists soon. I want to turn quickly, though, to the other type of bills and laws that we've been tracking. And these are the, we're calling them sort of anti-Semitism redefinition efforts. And these bills and laws have, they sort of are aiming to amend existing anti-discrimination laws to require the use of a vague and overbroad definition of anti-Semitism that would encompass nearly all criticism of Israel when assessing whether a violation has occurred. Florida and South Carolina have these laws in place. They've failed to pass in other states so far, and at the federal level. But in December 2019, Donald Trump signed an executive order directing government agencies to consider this distorted definition when investigating allegations of discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. You see it sort of already popping up during state legislative sessions this year, and we anticipate seeing more of these kinds of efforts in the coming months as well. These redefinition efforts have come under several different names and iterations. All of them seek to expand traditional definitions of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. The most prevalent is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, or IHRA-IRA definition. This definition includes illustrative examples of contemporary anti-Semitism that have come to be treated as part of the definition itself. And these include, you know, implying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Some states have gone further on that provision, describing, you know, human rights investigations that focus solely on Israel as an example of such a double standard. You know, so why is this problematic? You know, I think we see this definition and the sort of codification of the IRA definition as problematic and dangerous for multiple reasons. First, It blurs the lines between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel that will result in censorship of constitutionally protected political speech. So this is why civil liberties groups, including the ACLU, have opposed these bills over concerns that they'll infringe on First Amendment rights. Second, conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism distracts from understanding and addressing the dangerous and deadly anti-Semitism of white supremacists, stoked by the Trump administration and its allies, and that continues on today, obviously. And, you know, the author of the IHRA definition, Ken Stern, who has opposed the codification of the definition into law, has noted that the definition really fails to address the bigotry and hatred that drive the most dangerous manifestations of anti-Semitism. And finally, I think, you know, important to note that the definition aims to chill and silence those willing to speak out for Palestinian rights. And this is not a theoretical concern. It's really something that we know because it's been happening for years, even before the definition was written into law. Just one example I'll give, you know, in November 2018, there was a vigil organized by Jewish students at UC Berkeley to jointly mourn the deaths of Palestinian children killed in Gaza and Jewish people killed in the Pittsburgh massacre. And it became the subject of a Title VI complaint to the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And attorneys who filed the complaint, you know, alleged that the vigil was aimed at portraying Israel as a racist state that would fall under the IHRA definition, and called for the students who organized the vigil to be expelled on that basis. So, you know, I think this is one example, but I think, you know, the IHRA definition and its codification into law is sort of is sort of the current iteration of this smear that we see levied against Palestine activists throughout the years. I think the other smear, the common smear we see, is these false terrorism accusations. And, you know, we haven't seen this in legislation as much, but I think it's important in the current conversations around domestic terrorism in particular. And I just want to call your attention to it briefly. You know, this idea that Israel and Israel advocacy organizations really seek to paint anyone who supports Palestinian rights as supporting violence or terrorism. And, you know, this smear relies on anti-Muslim, xenophobic stereotypes about Arabs and Muslims. And the intention is really to make support for Palestinian human rights be perceived as support for terrorism. This is obviously, you know, really harmful and chilling because it really can scare people into self-censorship. We've seen this tactic deployed to vilify and criminalize different social movements with, you know, this idea that social movements are sort of seen as violent threats. And we see this in the anti-protest legislation that we see being introduced in a number of different states in response to Black Lives Matter protests now. So you can kind of see connections there between different movements. I think it's important to consider how these types of accusations have been wielded in the past in the context of these current discussions around domestic terrorism laws and who they might hurt ultimately. Where is this coming from, this repressive legislation, these efforts to silence Palestine advocates? I think, you know, two places in particular that I want to highlight here. The Israeli government and right-wing allies here in the US. So the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel has identified boycotts and BDS as an existential threat that they've devoted over $100 million to fighting. The same ministry has bragged about shutting down bank accounts of human rights defenders and taken credit for anti-boycott laws here in the US. Pro-Israel groups in the US are also working really closely with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which brings together conservative legislators and corporate lobbyists to develop and disseminate model legislation that safeguards corporate power and white supremacy. They have been responsible for pushing stand your ground and voter ID laws, including anti-boycott laws, among others. So, you know, I think that really sort of signals the anti-progressive nature of these bills that we're seeing that are targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights. And it's just important to understand some of those connections. I want to wrap up by sort of saying, you know, the repression that the movement faces, including legislative repression, is not unique to Palestinian rights advocacy. And it's really part of a broader context where the government has been cracking down on protest and our human rights defenders and those dissenting from the status quo. Human rights advocacy calling for freedom, justice, and equality for Palestinians, or advocacy that vigorously criticizes Israeli policies, is simply not the same as anti-Jewish hate or a stand-in for supporting terrorism. and so, even in the face of this, though, even in the face of these accusations and this repression, we see that the movement is growing. Students for Justice in Palestine chapters continue to grow. We see BDS wins accumulating. We see US representatives using the term apartheid in regards to Israel. All of these things are new and important. We also see affirmative legislation being proposed. We see efforts to repeal these bills, which hopefully we'll hear more about soon. We also see, efforts to sort of hold Israel accountable for its human rights violations against Palestinians. An example, the McCollum legislation that I mentioned earlier. So all of these things, I think, are really significant changes and important to keep in mind. I want to turn just really quickly to the new site that I mentioned, just to give you all a sense of sort of what it looks like, what it can do, what resources it offers, and also to maybe to make an ask, I guess, as well. So this is our homepage where we've been tracking these bills targeting advocacy for Palestinian rights. It has a few different features in that you can filter bills by type at the top here. You can see sort of status here on the right. And you can also sort of see how these bills have been introduced over time and sort of how it's picked up in recent years. Each state page has more information about the bills that have been introduced and passed in each state. I'm pulling up Minnesota just as an example. In each of these, you can kind of click to find more resources that are specific to that bill, media that's been on that sort of out there on that bill, opportunities to just take action or get involved, and links to the official bill page. So, obviously this is a work in progress. And so this is my plea to all of you. If you have information or resources that, if you see something that's not correct, or, we've missed something, please let us know. It's a work in progress for sure, and benefits from input from others. I think the only other last thing I'll flag here is this page on resources and action, where you can find, more information, statistics, sort of background on some of these issues that I've touched on about, the different kinds of laws, resources on the right to boycott and BDS, redefinition efforts, who's behind these laws. We also have collected legal letters on several of these bills that, you can kind of see some of the analysis and the constitutional issues that have been flagged, both from Palestine Legal, but also we've collected some from partners as well. And then, finally, just a page for taking action, where you can find legislative advocacy, resources, links to other movements, and a variety of different things on this page. One of the things we're hoping to add is a list of coalitions from different states of folks who are working to push back against these efforts, these repressive efforts. And, that's a work in progress. We hope to sort of, be collecting, contact information and links to, different groups active at the state level. So if you are part of a group that's active against, anti-boycott bills or other efforts to target Palestine advocacy, it'd be great if you could get in touch with us, let us know, what your group is, where you're active, and we would love to add you to the list. It's something we're hoping will be ready in the next week or so to share out. And with that, I am going to stop my screen share. I guess just one last thing, Palestine Legal, we're happy to be a resource where we can. Please explore the new site. If you have specific questions about legislation, or if you have legal questions, or if you're facing repression or harassment or pushback, please do reach out to us via our intake form. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, MEERA. We're going to turn now to a panel. And I'll introduce the panel. MEERA will be a part of it as well. The panel is our people from, they happen to be all United Methodists. Of course, they all work with others besides United Methodists in their home state. I'll start with John Darlington, who is a United Methodist minister from Minnesota, a longtime activist and leader in human rights struggles. He works with the statewide coalition to oppose anti-BDS legislation in Minnesota. Connie Hammond with the slightly grayer hair there, is a retired pharmacist from Columbus, Ohio, an active United Methodist layperson, and a leader in her statewide effort to overturn anti-BDS legislation. And Janet Lar-Lewis, with the colorful background, is retired United Methodist mission staff, was in Israel and Palestine for several decades, has served on United Methodist for Kairos Response's steering committee, and has been active in Virginia's effort to overturn anti-BDS legislation. We have some questions for them. I'm going to start, and then I will be looking to you to put some questions in the chat, and that will be one of the ways we continue with this webinar. So we do want your active participation, but I'm going to ask this first question to all of the groups, a fairly simple question, or all the people with statewide efforts. With what other groups are you working on this? So I'll start with John.
Thank you, John, and MEERA, thank you very much. I greet you all from Minnesota, where things are a lot sunnier here than they were leading up to the time of the verdict yesterday, when things didn't seem very sunny at all. So I'm one of the Minnesotans who's in a good mood today. For the better part of 15 years, I have been a part of an initiative of the Minnesota Annual Conference called the Palestine Israel Justice Project. It began over 20 years ago when two of our United Methodist missionaries stationed in Jerusalem and in the West Bank by the name of Peter and Mary Davies went to our Bishop John Hopkins and said, we want to start an initiative that protests the occupation from a United Methodist standpoint. And that is how our Palestine Israel Justice Project was born. We're still involved, primarily in an educational capacity. That brings me to John's question. We also involve ourselves where we can with hands-on protest and lobbying. And so there is a group in Minnesota, I'm glad to say, that is the Minnesota BDS community that is on the forefront of protesting the Minnesota statutes from 2017 against BDS. And they are currently working also on a lawsuit that will contest the Minnesota 2017 statutes from a First Amendment point of view. Even though I believe those lawsuits are absolutely necessary to end gross injustices, I'm hoping that even though our bill for repeal, when I say our, it is authored with legislative sponsors and authors from the Minnesota legislature, even though it never even made committee this year, we were hoping it would at least do that. And having been dropped basically and temporarily in the legislature, it didn't go anywhere. And we may talk more about that later. I'm hoping that next year will be a different story, because at least in Minnesota, budgeting happens on a 2-year basis. This was the year legislators are preoccupied with the budgeting constraints. And so our repeal of the 2017 statutes didn't get off the ground for that and other reasons. So in 2002, we're hoping that with this year leading up to 2022, we'll be able to influence enough legislatures to really establish some critical mass towards the repeal of those 2017 statutes.
Thank you so much, John. Connie, you're up. You need to unmute, of course.
Okay, well, in Ohio, we already had sort of a loose coalition of groups and people that were interested in doing activism for Palestinian human rights in Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati areas. And but when House Bill 476 was introduced 4 years ago, we formed what we call the Free Speech Coalition. and it was a small group of activists led by Doug Kerr. And we had two major purposes. We wanted to get as many people involved in providing opposition testimony in the Ohio legislature to the anti-BDS bill, and to also make sure that we covered all the aspects, the legal, the human rights issues. And so basically, we had a lot of phone conversations and meetings. We met in Columbus and organized it. And there were 3 opponent hearings in the House Government Accountability Committee, and there was 1 Senate hearing, and there were quite a few speakers. Most of the people in our coalition were affiliated with other activist groups, JVP Columbus and Cleveland, Peace Action Cleveland, and various religious communities. And everyone, I don't know what everyone reached out to, the groups that everyone reached out to besides that, but I know that we also reached out to Students for Justice in Palestine at various universities in Ohio, CARE Ohio, Democratic Socialists of Central Ohio, and other, because all of these issues are connected. So we were able to get quite a few people who could speak to our members of the state legislature on all the different aspects of why we oppose this bill.
Okay, thank you, Janet.
Thanks, John. I'm going to speak a little more generally for people who are maybe interested in getting involved in contacting their elected officials on this issue. First of all, if you feel you don't know enough, find someone who does. It's very easy. We've already talked about coalitions. In Virginia, we have the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights. It used to be called the Virginia Coalition for Palestinian Rights, but we realized that the human rights issue is broad enough and would absorb a lot of other issues that would help us work as coalitions with other organizations, with the Black Lives Matter movements, with Jewish Voice for Peace, with Palestine Legal, with the ACLU. If you work in conjunction with other organizations on like-minded legislation, because it affects everyone, then you can be a lot more effective. In Virginia, we have been able to, fortunately, defeat the anti-BDS legislation, which they keep trying to tack on to a very good human rights law as an amendment to that law. And we've been able to defeat it for several years now. They keep bringing it up, and it's been defeated every time. We can get rather creative sometimes. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement came up with the idea that to honor Rosa Parks on her birthday as a Virginia holiday in an effort to recognize the rights of boycotting. And obviously this would affect boycotting the BDS movement for Palestinian rights. Unfortunately, that got tabled because of other issues that came up at the same time. We're in Virginia, so he had a lot of the anti-Civil War stuff going on at the same time, but which, again, worked to our advantage. A lot of these issues, our basic rights to free speech and to boycotting also came up in that movement. If you don't know where to go and how to begin to get involved, check out, keep watching the Palestine Legal website. That's going to be a really key resource for legislation and for organizations that are already working on these issues. Ask around. There may be other people in your area. Check the websites to just look up where are other organizations working on Palestinian rights or anti-BDS legislation that you might be able to hook into? It's a big movement. It's a growing movement, as MEERA said. So it's not impossible. Don't be afraid. There are others who have been doing this for many, many years, and will appreciate any efforts that you can contribute. Thank you.
All right. MEERA, anything you'd want to add hearing these testimonies?
I think everything that everyone said is super helpful, and I would just add, there's other national level organizations that are also doing this work, and I think some of them have been mentioned. But Jewish Voice for Peace has also been sort of ramping up some of its state level work and is connecting, with resources and sort of, it's not about reinventing the wheel every single time. These bills are really similar across, almost across the board, and so you don't need to sort of start from scratch if you're trying to figure out, what are the talking points, what should I be saying? People have been doing this, and so the resources are there.
I'm going to start with you again, MEERA, and I'm going to ask just a kind of a few sentence answers from our panelists. What's the value of activists opposing these laws, even when there's a good chance that you won't win? If you're in a very conservative place, or a place that where there's a high degree of support for these anti-BDS laws, what's the value of actively opposing them? I'll start with you, MEERA, and then move on if any of the rest want to comment.
Yeah, I want to hear from everyone else, but from my perspective, from Pal Legal's perspective, it's hugely important. I think there's great value in doing this organizing work and sort of both raising the awareness within your communities, with lawmakers. Sort of the shift is incremental, but it's sort of undeniable, right? That the conversation around Palestine and Palestinian rights here in the U.S. is markedly different than 20 years ago, and that the space has sort of increased, where people sort of are able to talk about Palestinian human rights and to criticize Israeli policies in ways that wasn't really possible, I think, and it wasn't happening in the past. And that's as a direct result of the organizing that's happening. Even if the laws are being passed, the organizing is critical. And the other point I would make is also it's not just as I think Janet and others were saying, it's not just about these laws targeting Palestine advocacy. This is, across the board, there is sort of a crackdown on dissent, and this idea that protest is problematic and should be sort of narrowed and limited in a variety of different ways. And so the opportunities for really sort of working across different justice movements and to kind of build that coalition together to push back across all of these efforts, I think, is really critical as well. So, I think lots of reasons, but those are a couple that I would mention.
Yeah, I'm going to ask the rest of the panel if just raise your hand or whatever, but I would like to know, not only why it's important, even if the chances of success, in overturning legislation are slim, but then also just a comment on how it feels to be doing this for those persons who think, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing it. Just a personal word from you as well. Let's start with you, Janet, this time. Can we?
Sure. I used to tell people you sometimes feel like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who said, you have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same place. It feels like that very often, but every once in a while you get a success, and heaven forbid we stop running with this effort. You have to go into it with the mindset of being persistent. I think persistence is really key. Also, with regard to things that may not go your way, a lot of times this can get some very bad publicity, but even bad publicity is good publicity because it starts the conversation, and people who may not have heard anything about this start to ask some of the right questions. So even when an effort may be defeated, the idea that someone is opposing it will get known, and then people will start asking, why are these people opposed to this? they need to ask those questions right from the get-go, or no one's gonna, if the conversation stops, that's when we start running backwards, and we don't want that to happen.
Right. Connie, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here. I know that you were trepidatious when you were asked to communicate directly with your state government and speak and write. Can you tell us what that was like and how you overcame those hesitations?
You know, it is intimidating. It is to testify. And this was the first time I had ever done it. But my feeling was that it was an opportunity to speak to a lot of people all at once about Palestinian human rights. And this is why we're in this struggle. And I think two reasons. The BDS movement in general provides us with a tool for informing people about the human rights violations in Palestine, the egregious, the home demolitions, the detentions of children, and the land confiscation and the expulsions, and the day-to-day life of Palestinians that none of these legislators would have known about. I mean, they deal with local politics. They don't deal with international affairs. So it's a good opportunity to inform people. And I think the purpose of these bills in general is not necessarily to stop the economic impacts of the BDS movement as much as to stop the voices like ours from speaking out on human rights. So if we don't, then they win. And the second thing that was so wonderful about the whole experience of doing this was working with other people in our coalition. We were a very diverse group. There were doctors, attorneys, university professors, but a lot of the testimony was just from normal citizens like me. And another thing that was impactful was people who had actually had experience living and working in the West Bank, like my friend MEERA Yoder, who worked with Christian peacemaker teams and explained some of the things that she saw going on. So it was a very moving experience, and I got to know these people better. And we actually, when we met in Columbus, would go out to dinner to a great Palestinian restaurant and just have great conversation. So, and because of our forming this coalition, we also now keep in touch with each other. We watch out for, we wouldn't have had this coalition, but we still communicate, we still do things cooperatively, and we're on the lookout for other types of bills to be introduced in Ohio. For instance, we also some of us testified against HCR 10 that was aimed at limiting free speech in Ohio universities and campuses. And we're continuing to try and find someone who's been denied a contract under the anti-boycott bill, so that we could find someone who would be willing to be a plaintiff, because we would like to see it overturned in Ohio. But given the, it's unfortunate that we failed in our attempt. We gave it a good shot, but given the makeup of the Ohio legislature, I don't think any of us knew that it was doubtful that we could stop passage of the bill, but we just couldn't let it be passed without opposition and without taking the opportunity to talk about Palestinian human rights.
John, I'm going to give you a chance too, but I'm going to add to it. What tools have you found most effective in your organization? And then also just a personal word. I want to leave chance for others to contribute. So this is a kind of a short question, if you don't mind.
Well, the tool that comes to mind as a United Methodist, with apologies to all of you who don't happen to be United Methodist. It's what we call connection with a capital C. That's the tool that not only brings about the emotional rewards of the heart, like the one Connie has said, that have come about because of her connections. People who share, the courage they have to muster up to put themselves on the line. That, John, that's the one I would say. And connections means that we United Methodists avail ourselves of the communications which put us in touch with others.
John, have you
not
seen
just
this? Have you seen this in other denominations as well?
No, John, I'm sorry. I can only really speak to my own. I'm a die-in-the-wool Wesleyan. and on that topic, Wesleyanism, which is another code name for Methodism, has at its roots an evangelical emphasis. And evangelical to me means goodness, good news, good feelings. And so folks, you do get good feelings when you take on causes that are going to be helpful to you, but also a huge challenge when you realize that we have a God of justice, a God who is in charge of that arc over the universe that leans on the part of justice. And we discover abilities that we never knew we had. One more thing, John, quickly.
Sure.
Last night, Minnesotans and worldwide citizens were appalled in a wonderful way when all three counts came down against Derek Chauvin, against the defendant in the Rodney King case. Now, here's the thing. For thoughtful persons in leadership capacities, their first reaction was, I'm elated, I can't believe this. And then quickly it was, uh-oh, let's make sure we do not let this momentum come to a stop. Heaven forbid that the momentum we feel now and that we're seeing in cities all across the US and small towns and across the world will come to a grinding halt because of this decision of such huge import. So when it comes to Palestine and Israel, there is so little knowledge and understanding of the issues that if and when there is what John called a win, or let's call it a legislative victory, there is a danger of the educational process and the momentum of understanding and human connection coming to a grinding halt. That's the last thing we need. That's why it's gratifying to keep the movement going and to not feel defeated or that our energy is completely depleted when we run into one defeat after another.
Okay. I'm going to ask another question. And again, we have about 10 minutes left. So many great questions have come up, and I'm having a hard time choosing among them. Here's one. How do you explain progressives supporting anti-BDS laws? How do they explain themselves? And again, please, not long answers. If you can just a word or two, and I won't ask all of you to contribute, just anybody have an insight there. We call them progressives except for Palestine, you know that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have a suggestion. My state representative, when we were testifying, was the ranking member of the Government Accountability Committee, an oversight committee, and he is a wonderful progressive representative, except on Palestine. And his argument about opposing the anti-BDS was that he conflated it with the Arab League boycott, and that in 1977, Congress passed an amendment to the Export Administration Act that penalized American companies that cooperated with unsanctioned boycotts by foreign nations. I had no knowledge of this and I had no way of answering him. But recently when I read Except for Palestine, which is a great new book by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick. They have a whole chapter on criminalizing BDS, and they explain that the differences that the BDS movement is distinct from the era boycott in that it wasn't for profit and it wasn't by a company. It's a grassroots movement of activists, and that's what was really helpful was I could use the Kairos document to explain what the situation on the ground was and why United Methodists for Kairos response existed. But anyway, those 2 points that Mark Lamont Hill makes and Michael Plitnick in their book is that this is what differentiates this type of a boycott from the Arab League boycott and makes it protected under international law. And not being an attorney, I hope I didn't say anything wrong, but read the book and it explains it further.
I get nervous around attorneys as well.
I've met some wonderful attorneys.
Sure. And if anyone else would like to comment on that particular question, but go ahead.
If I may, you all know that we have elected officials in the federal government who are elected on progressive platforms, and yet their worn out policy towards Israel is they are our friend, and we as Americans ought not do any harm. And then at that point, of course, something like BDS is construed as doing harm to our best friend, Israel. But I want to say something else. The Holocaust is becoming in educational circles a subject of great concern because it's starting to die out. As survivors of the Holocaust and as loved ones of survivors of the Holocaust, attrition away, suddenly there are fewer, or at least a smaller percentage of Americans, and certainly a larger percentage of American children and youth who don't even know what the Holocaust is. A progressive might very well say, I'm not going to let that happen. The Holocaust is where evil showed itself in such a ghastly way that my life will never be the same. And to some degree will always be defined by whatever religion we are, by the horrors of the Holocaust. So there is a progressive attitude which flies in the face, of course, of someone who sees that what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza as a Holocaust in its own making, even though there are a lot of differences between the two. Yeah. So when I think of progressives, I think of in their most excellent form, and I'll go back to Wesleyanism and say that as Wesleyans, we are called to do acts of mercy and acts of compassion as those who have compassion and mercy for the least, the last, and the left out, regardless of their ethnicity or nationality.
Sure. I think what I'm hearing is that it's important to understand your opponents and to continue to work if there's any chance at all of persuading, and to keep the pressure on, but also understand. I have a brief question, I believe, for MEERA, and that is, are there pending court cases related to anti-BDS legislation? Are there ways to challenge the legislation? In other words, for companies to take a stand, or entities to try to see if they can get sued by the state for support of Palestine? Anything at all that you know of that's on the horizon? MEERA.
Yeah, just I'm going to put a couple links in the chat. Just on this is a page on the site that kind of gives a summary and updates on the different legal cases. I think after the Arkansas Court of Appeals decision earlier this year, Arkansas is requesting, the full court to review that decision. That case is not over, and Arkansas is trying to uphold its anti-boycott law. So that's still pending. There's a challenge in Maryland that's still pending. And this page can give you some updates. Just to be clear, Palestine Legal is not, we're not the litigators, we're not the ones bringing these cases. We are small, and litigation requires a lot of capacity, but the ACLU and CARE have been at the forefront of challenging these laws. And I think all of their websites also have more information on the status of these cases. Just on that last question, though, I just want to on sort of the issue of progressives and PEPs and ways to challenge that. I think it's really one thing I'll say. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Like, that is a clear and scary problem that we have to confront in the United States. That real anti-Semitism that we need to address as part of sort of increased sort of the white supremacist bigotry that we see across the board. I think that the challenge and the importance of articulating the sort of the position is that these laws that sort of both distort anti-Semitism to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism are not the answer to that problem. And I think similarly, anti-boycott laws are not the answer to that problem. And so, it is an important and critical problem to address, and but that these laws are not it. And so that is one of the messages. And I think also I'll just drop in the chat here another resource from partner organizations, a platform for sort of coming from Palestinians here in the US that sort of sets out what a progressive, sort of the progressive vision that includes justice for Palestine and Palestinian rights. And so I would just urge you to kind of take a look at that. It has a series of demands and kind of explains, just a vision that sort of progressivism that in which Palestine is sort of centered and very much an integral part of that vision. So hope it's helpful.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our hour. I feel we have an obligation to those who kind of contract with us for an hour, so we're going to close this down. I want to just say a couple things. One is there is some legislation that is coming forward in our next general conference. United Methodist Church is undergoing, like a lot of denominations, some turmoil because of the virus. And also we have some internal divisions. For those of you not United Methodist, don't worry about it too much. But at our 2022 General Conference, we are intending to have some legislation that will expressly oppose the suppression of time-honored and nonviolent methods of correcting injustice through boycotts and divestment. So that's something to keep in mind. I want to especially remind our United Methodists on the call. For all of you who are part of any organization, we hope that you do take this opportunity to reach out to other organizations within your state. I think it's been expressed pretty clearly that those are important connections to be made. Somebody expressed that the connections can be delightful and surprising. People across the board. I just wanted to say a word that we talked about progressives. We had in United Methodist circles, and I think elsewhere, some exciting support occasionally from people who label themselves political conservatives, but see this as an issue of basic fairness and justice. And I don't want to exclude those persons as well. We are at the close, so I'm going to thank all of our panelists, John Darlington, Connie Hammond, Janet Lar-Lewis, and MEERA SHAH, on behalf of you all, and thank you all for being here. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of these very excellent questions, and I hope there will be ways to have them answered later. You can contact us the same way that we contacted you through the Methodist Federation for Social Action or United Methodist for Kairos Response, or MEERA's organization, Palestine Legal.